The voice came from somewhere deep in the canyon, floating up like smoke from a prayer fire, and Pete Rawlings knew that sound would change his life before he'd even laid eyes on the woman making it. He'd been riding hard for 3 days straight through the New Mexico territory, trying to outrun the restlessness that had been eating at him since winter. It was April of 1878, and the desert was coming alive with wildflowers that painted the red rocks in splashes of yellow and white. His horse, a sturdy bay named Copper, picked his way carefully along the rim of the canyon, and that's when Pete heard it. The song had no words he could understand, just pure melody that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising and falling like the wind through the pines. Pete pulled Copper to a stop and sat there listening, his heart doing something strange in his chest. He was 26 years old and had been drifting from ranch to ranch for the better part of 8 years, never finding anything that felt like it might stick. He told himself he was looking for good land, or maybe the right outfit to sign on with permanently, but sitting there on that canyon rim with that voice washing over him, he realized he'd been searching for something else entirely. The song came again, clearer this time, and Pete could tell it was coming from somewhere down near the canyon floor. He looked around for a path down, spotted a narrow trail that switchbacked along the rock face, and urged Copper forward. The descent was slow and careful, the afternoon sun blazing against the red stone walls that rose up on either side. As they went lower, the song grew louder, and Pete could hear the richness in it, the way it echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to multiply itself. When he finally reached the bottom, he found himself in a narrow passage between towering cliffs, with a thin stream running over smooth stones. He followed the water and the voice, rounding a bend, and there she was. She stood in a small clearing where the canyon widened, barefoot in the shallow stream, her dark hair hanging loose down her back nearly to her waist. Her dress was simple, made of faded blue calico, and she had her eyes closed as she sang, her face tilted up toward the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. Pete had never seen anyone so beautiful in his entire life. He sat there on Copper, not moving, barely breathing, afraid that any sound might shatter whatever spell was happening here. The woman's voice rose higher, hitting notes that seemed impossible, then fell back down to something low and haunting that made Pete's throat tight. When the song ended, silence rushed back in, broken only by the babbling of the stream and the creak of leather as Copper shifted his weight. The woman opened her eyes and looked directly at Pete, and he saw that her eyes were green, the color of new leaves in spring. "How long have you been sitting there?" she asked. Her voice, when she spoke, was different from when she sang, but just as compelling. There was an accent to it, something Pete couldn't quite place. "Long enough to know I needed to hear more," Pete said, and then felt foolish for saying something so forward to a stranger. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "I'm sorry for intruding, miss. I was riding along the rim and heard you singing. I thought maybe someone was in trouble." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "And do I look like I'm in trouble?" "No, madam. You look like you belong here." Pete climbed down from Copper, his legs stiff from the ride. "I'm Pete Rawlings. I've been working cattle ranches between here and Texas." The woman stepped out of the stream, water dripping from the hem of her dress. "Grace Romano," she said. "My father has a homestead about 2 miles east of here. This canyon runs through our land." "I didn't mean to trespass," Pete said quickly. "I'll head back up if you want." Grace shook her head, wringing water from her skirt. "The canyon doesn't belong to anyone, not really. My father just filed the papers that say it does, but the canyon was here long before us, and it'll be here long after." She looked at him with those green eyes, studying him in a way that made Pete feel exposed. Why were you riding so hard? Running from something. Running towards something, maybe, Pete said, though I didn't know what until just now. The words hung in the air between them, bold and true, and Grace's cheeks colored slightly. That's quite a thing to say to someone you just met. I know it. But your voice, it's like nothing I've ever heard. Where did you learn to sing like that? Grace picked up a pair of worn boots from a flat rock and sat down to put them on. My mother taught me. She was from Italy, came over when she was 16 to marry my father. She used to sing all the time old songs from her village. Grace's voice softened. She died 2 years ago. Fever took her in the winter. I'm sorry, Pete said and meant it. The singing helps, Grace said, lacing up her boots. When I come out here and let it out, it's like she's still with me somehow. She stood up and looked at Pete again. What about you? What are you running toward? Pete thought about that, turning his hat in his hands. I've been drifting for a long time, working different ranches, never staying anywhere more than a season or two. Always felt like there was something missing, like I was supposed to be somewhere else but didn't know where. Then I heard you singing, and it was like something clicked into place. Grace studied him for a long moment, then said, Would you like to meet my father? Our homestead isn't far, and he always welcomes travelers. We don't get many visitors out here. I'd like that very much, Pete said. They walked together, Pete leading Copper, following the stream as it wound through the canyon. Grace told him about the homestead, how her father had claimed the land 5 years ago and had been working it ever since, trying to raise cattle and grow what crops the dry land would allow. It was hard work, she said, but it was theirs. You have brothers or sisters? Pete asked. No, just me. My mother had trouble with childbirth. I was her only one that lived. Grace pushed a low-hanging branch out of the way. What about you? 2 brothers and a sister back in Missouri. Haven't seen them in years. We didn't part on good terms. Pete didn't elaborate, and Grace didn't push. The canyon walls began to lower as they walked, opening up into a wider valley. Pete could see a small house in the distance, made of adobe with a wooden roof, and a barn beside it that looked like it had been built from whatever materials could be scrounged. Cattle grazed in a fenced pasture, maybe 30 head, and there was a small garden plot near the house. A man was working near the barn, repairing a section of fence. He looked up as they approached, and Pete saw that he was perhaps 50, with weathered skin and gray streaking his dark hair. He had the same green eyes as Grace. Papa, this is Pete Rawlings, Grace called out. I found him in the canyon. He heard me singing. The man set down his tools and walked over, wiping his hands on his pants. He was shorter than Pete, but had the solid build of someone who'd spent his life doing hard labor. Antonio Romano, he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. You're welcome here, Mr. Rawlings. Just Pete, sir, and I appreciate the hospitality. Antonio's eyes moved to Copper. That's a fine horse. You've been traveling far, from Texas most recently. Working my way through the territory, looking for something that feels right. Antonio nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. That's a search many men make. Few find what they're looking for. He glanced at Grace, then back to Pete. You'll stay for supper. My daughter is a good cook, learned from her mother. I'd be honored, Pete said. The evening that followed felt strangely natural to Pete, like he'd known these people for years instead of hours. He helped Antonio finish the fence repair while Grace prepared the meal. And they talked about cattle and land, and the challenges of making a life in the harsh New Mexico territory. Antonio had come from Italy as a young man, worked in mines until he'd saved enough to claim land and had built this homestead with his own hands. It's not much, Antonio said, hammering in a nail, but it's mine. No one can take it from me. A man's land is his freedom, Pete agreed. Over supper, Simple but delicious stew made from dried beef and vegetables from the garden. Grace asked Pete about his wandering. In 8 years, you never found anywhere you wanted to stay. Pete shook his head, soaking up the last of his stew with a piece of bread. Never felt right. Always felt like I was just passing through, even when I'd been somewhere for months, like I was waiting for something. And now, Antonio asked, watching Pete carefully. Pete met Grace's eyes across the table. Now I think I found it. Grace looked away, but Pete saw the smile she was trying to hide. After supper, Pete helped Grace clean the dishes while Antonio sat outside smoking his pipe. The small house was cozy, with simple furniture that Antonio had clearly made himself. There were touches of Grace's mother everywhere, though. Embroidered cloths on the table, pottery on the shelves, and in one corner, a small shrine with a picture of the Virgin Mary and a photograph of a beautiful dark-haired woman. "That's her," Grace said softly, following Pete's gaze. "My mother, Maria. That photograph was taken in Santa Fe about a year before she died. It cost my father 2 months' wages, but he said it was worth it to have her image preserved." Pete looked at the photograph, seeing where Grace got her beauty from. She looked kind. She was. She sang while she worked, while she cooked, while she tended the garden. This whole place was always full of music when she was alive. Grace dried the last dish and set it on the shelf. "After she died, it was so quiet, I couldn't stand it. That's why I started going to the canyon to sing. I couldn't do it here, not without her." "Maybe someday you will," Pete said. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and Pete felt that click again, that sense of rightness. "Maybe," she said softly. Antonio offered Pete a place to sleep in the barn, and Pete accepted gratefully. He settled into the hay with his bedroll, Copper munching contentedly in a nearby stall, and lay there thinking about green eyes and a voice like answered prayers. He'd been in New Mexico for less than a day, and already felt more at home than he had anywhere in the past 8 years. The next morning, Pete woke to the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee. He washed up at the pump outside the barn and walked to the house, where Grace was making breakfast and Antonio was already dressed and ready for the day's work. "I was thinking," Antonio said, pouring Pete a cup of coffee. "You said you're looking for work. I could use help around here. The ranch is small, but it's more than one man can handle properly, especially with spring calving starting. I can't pay much, but there's food and a place to sleep and honest work." Pete felt his heart jump. "I'd be glad to help, sir. I'm good with cattle and horses, and I can fix most anything that breaks." "Good, then it's settled." Antonio clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll start after breakfast." The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt as natural to Pete as breathing. He woke with the sun, worked alongside Antonio during the day, and in the evenings, he'd wash up and join them for supper. Grace's cooking got better as she got more comfortable having him around, and Pete found himself looking forward to those evening meals more than anything else in his day. Most days, Grace would disappear in the late afternoon for an hour or two, and Pete knew she was going to the canyon to sing. He wanted to follow, to hear that incredible voice again, but he held back, understanding that the singing was something private for her, a way of connecting with her mother's memory. One evening, about 3 weeks after Pete had arrived, he and Antonio were checking on a cow that looked close to calving when Antonio said, "My daughter likes you." Pete nearly dropped the lantern he was holding. "Sir, I would never presume." Antonio held up a hand. "I'm not blind, Pete. I see how you look at her, and I see how she looks at you when you're not watching. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that if your intentions are honorable, you have my blessing to court her." Pete's throat went tight. "They are, sir. Honorable, I mean. I've never met anyone like Grace. She's strong and kind, and when she sings, it's like the whole world makes sense. Her mother was the same way," Antonio said quietly. When Maria sang, I felt like I could do anything, build anything, survive anything. He looked at Pete in the dim light of the barn. Grace deserves a man who will appreciate that gift, who won't try to silence it or make it small. Can you be that man? I can try, sir. I want to try. Antonio nodded. Then talk to her. Tell her how you feel. Life is too short for dancing around the truth. But Pete found it harder than he'd expected to find the right words. For the next few days, he tried to catch Grace alone, to tell her what was building in his chest. But every time he got close, his courage failed him. He was a cowboy, more comfortable with horses than with expressing emotions, and the depth of what he felt for Grace terrified him. It was Grace who finally forced the issue. On a Saturday evening in early May, after supper was finished and Antonio had excused himself to bed early, claiming tiredness, Grace turned to Pete and said, "Walk with me." They walked out into the warm evening, the sky painted in oranges and purples, the air full of the smell of sage and creosote. Grace led him toward the canyon, following a path Pete had learned well by now. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the spot where Pete had first seen her, the little clearing with the stream. "I've been waiting for you to say something," Grace said, standing at the edge of the water. "But I'm tired of waiting, so I'm going to say it instead." She turned to face him, her green eyes bright in the fading light. "I think about you all the time, Pete Rawlings. When you're working with my father during the day, when you're sitting across from me at supper, when I'm lying in bed at night. You've only been here a month, but it feels like you've always been here, like you were always supposed to be here." Pete's heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. "Grace, let me finish," she said, holding up a hand. "I know it's forward of me to say these things. A proper lady would wait for the man to speak first. But my mother taught me that life is too precious to waste on propriety, that when you find something real, you hold on to it." She took a step closer to him. "Tell me I'm not imagining this. Tell me you feel it too." Pete closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. They were small and strong, calloused from work. "I've been trying to find the words for weeks. Every time I look at you, I feel like I'm drowning and being saved at the same time. I heard you singing that first day and I knew. I knew you were what I'd been searching for all these years." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because I'm a fool," Pete said. And then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and the whole world narrowed down to just the two of them in the fading light, with the stream babbling beside them and the canyon walls rising up around them like a blessing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace laughed. "My father is going to pretend to be surprised when we tell him." "He already gave me his blessing," Pete admitted. "Told me to court you properly. Then I suppose you'd better start courting me properly, Pete Rawlings." The next months were the happiest of Pete's life. He and Grace courted with her father's approval, taking walks together in the evenings, sitting close together after supper while Antonio pretended to read. Pete learned about Grace's dreams, how she wanted to expand the ranch, maybe even build a small church someday where people could come to worship, since the nearest town was a full day's ride away. Grace learned about Pete's family back in Missouri, the fight he'd had with his father that had sent him west, the regret he carried for words spoken in anger. "You should write to them," Grace said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "Life is too short for estrangement. I wouldn't know what to say. Tell them you're happy. Tell them you've found love. Tell them you forgive them even if you don't yet. Words have power, Pete. They can heal as well as harm." So Pete wrote a letter to his family, the first in 8 years, and sent it off with a traveling merchant who passed through. He didn't expect a response, but the act of writing it, of reaching out, lifted something heavy from his chest. In late July, Pete asked Antonio for Grace's hand in marriage properly, in the parlor of the small house, hat in his hands and heart in his throat. Antonio, who'd clearly been expecting this, made Pete sweat for a few minutes before breaking into a wide smile and embracing him. "You're a good man, Pete. You'll take care of my daughter." "With my life, sir." They were married in September of 1878 in a small ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who made his rounds through the territory. Antonio stood as witness, along with a few neighbors from the scattered homesteads in the area. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved, and Pete wore a new suit he'd bought on a trip to the town of Las Cruces, which was the nearest settlement of any size, about 40 miles west. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Pete kissed Grace with all the love and joy that had been building in him since that first day in the canyon. The small gathering cheered, and Antonio wiped tears from his eyes. The celebration was simple but joyful. Antonio had slaughtered a steer and they roasted it over an open fire. The neighbors brought what they could, and there was music and dancing as the sun went down. And finally, when the stars were out in full force, Grace sang. She stood by the fire, her new husband's hand in hers, and sang the songs her mother had taught her, old Italian melodies about love and home and the persistence of the heart. Pete watched her, this woman who was now his wife, and felt something settle deep in his soul. This was where he was meant to be. This was who he was meant to be with. Antonio had built a small addition onto the house for the newlyweds, a private room with its own entrance. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and that first night as man and wife, lying together in the darkness, Grace whispered, "I want to sing here now. In the house. I want to fill it with music again, the way Mama did." "Then sing," Pete said, holding her close. "Sing every day for the rest of our lives." Their first year of marriage was not without its challenges. The drought that summer was worse than usual, and they lost several head of cattle. Pete worked himself nearly to exhaustion digging a new well, determined to find water to keep the herd alive. Grace worked just as hard, tending the garden, preserving what food they could, stretching every resource to its limit. But through it all, there was love and music. Grace sang while she worked, just as her mother had, and the small homestead seemed to come alive again. Antonio, who had been quiet and withdrawn since his wife's death, began to smile more, to laugh at Pete's jokes, to take joy in watching his daughter flourish in her marriage. In the spring of 1879, Grace told Pete she was expecting a child. He was mending a fence when she came walking out to him, her hand on her still flat belly, a glow about her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply. Pete dropped his tools and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and told him to put her down before he made her dizzy. Antonio cried when they told him, saying it was the happiest news he'd had since Grace was born. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Grace continued to work, though Pete and Antonio both tried to get her to rest more. She refused, saying her mother had worked until the day before she gave birth, and she was just as strong. "Stubborn is what you are," Pete said, but he was smiling. In November, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, and Pete paced outside the bedroom while Antonio's wife's old friend, a woman named Rosa who lived on a neighboring homestead and knew about birthing, helped Grace through it. Pete had never been so scared in his life, hearing Grace cry out in pain, knowing there was nothing he could do to help. But when he finally heard the baby's cry, thin and reedy in the cool night air, relief flooded through him. Rosa opened the door, smiling. "You have a son." Pete stumbled into the room to find Grace propped up in bed, exhausted and pale but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. The baby had dark hair and was red-faced from crying, his little fists waving in the air. "Thomas," Grace said. "For your grandfather, Thomas Antonio Rawlings." Pete sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at his son in wonder. "He's perfect." "He looks like you," Grace said, touching the baby's tiny nose. "Poor kid," Pete said, and Grace laughed weakly. Antonio came in then, and when he saw his grandson, he openly wept. "Maria would have loved to see this," he said, touching the baby's head gently. "She would have been so happy." The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Thomas was a healthy baby with strong lungs, and he kept them all awake with his demands. But Pete found he didn't mind the exhaustion. Watching Grace nurse their son, singing to him softly in Italian, he felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. The homestead continued to grow. With Pete's hard work and Antonio's knowledge, they expanded the herd and improved the land. They built a better barn, dug another well, and planted more crops. It was still hard work, still a daily struggle against the harsh land and unpredictable weather, but it was theirs, and it was good. When Thomas was 2, Grace found herself expecting again. This time the pregnancy was harder, and she was sick for the first few months, unable to keep much food down. Pete worried constantly, remembering what she'd said about her mother's difficulty with childbirth. But Grace remained strong, insisting she was fine, that this was just how her body handled pregnancy. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1882, easier than Thomas had been. They named her Maria Rosa, for Grace's mother and the woman who had helped birth both children. Maria had her mother's green eyes and her grandmother's Italian beauty, and she was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn curiosity. Antonio doted on both grandchildren, teaching Thomas to ride as soon as the boy was old enough to sit on a horse, telling Maria stories from the old country in a mixture of Italian and English that somehow she seemed to understand. Life settled into a good rhythm. The ranch prospered enough that they could hire occasional help during busy seasons, and Pete no longer felt the restlessness that had driven him for so many years. Everything he needed was right here, in this small corner of New Mexico, in this woman and these children and this land they were building together. In the fall of 1884, when Thomas was 5 and Maria was 2, Pete's brother showed up at the ranch unannounced. Pete was working in the barn when he heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked out to see a man riding up, older than Pete remembered but unmistakably his brother Marcus. Pete walked out slowly, unsure what to expect. The last time he'd seen Marcus, they'd been shouting at each other, fighting over their father's rigid expectations and Pete's refusal to follow the path laid out for him. Marcus dismounted and stood there, hat in his hands, looking uncertain. "Pete," he said, "it's good to see you." "Marcus." "What are you doing here? I got your letter. The one you sent 6 years ago. It took a while to track you down, but I wanted to find you." Marcus looked around at the ranch, the house, the corrals. "Looks like you've done well for yourself." "I've been blessed," Pete said carefully. "What about you? How's the family? Pa died 2 years ago. Heart gave out. Ma's still alive, living with our sister. I took over the farm." Marcus shifted his weight. "Before Pa died, he regretted the things he said to you. He was too proud to reach out, but he talked about you, wondered where you were, if you were happy." Pete felt a lump in his throat. "I wish I'd known. I would have come home." "I know you would have. That's why I'm here, to tell you that you were missed, that you are missed, and to meet the family you wrote about." Grace came out of the house then, wiping her hands on her apron, Thomas and Maria trailing behind her. Pete introduced them, and Marcus's eyes went wide when he heard Grace sing out a greeting to the children in Italian. "That's the voice that led you here, isn't it?" Marcus said quietly. In your letter, you said you followed a voice to find your home. That's her. That's her, Pete agreed. Marcus stayed for a week, getting to know his brother's family, helping with the ranch work, marveling at how different Pete seemed from the angry young man who'd left Missouri 8 years before. On his last night, sitting around the fire outside while the children slept and Grace and Antonio had gone to bed, Marcus said, "You found what you were looking for, Pete. I can see it in your eyes. You're happy." "I am," Pete said. "Happier than I ever thought possible. I'm sorry it took me leaving to find it." "Don't be sorry. Sometimes a man has to leave home to find out who he really is." Marcus poked at the fire with a stick. "Ma would love to meet Grace and the kids if you ever feel like making the trip to Missouri." "Maybe someday," Pete said. "When the children are older." They promised to write regularly to stay in touch, and when Marcus rode away the next morning, Pete felt a weight lift that he hadn't even known he was carrying. The breach with his family wasn't completely healed, but it was mended, and that was enough. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of the children. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking after Pete, with a natural way with horses that made his grandfather proud. Maria remained quiet but showed an early talent for singing, her young voice already carrying hints of the power her mother possessed. When Thomas was 8 and Maria was 5, Grace became pregnant again. This pregnancy was the hardest yet, and at 31, Grace felt every day of it. She was confined to bed for the last 2 months, unable to do much besides rest, and let Rosa and a younger neighbor woman named Elena help care for the house and children. Pete was terrified. He'd seen too many women die in childbirth, and Grace was older now, more fragile than she'd been with the first 2. But Grace remained calm, even peaceful. "I'm going to be fine," she told him one night as he sat beside the bed, holding her hand. "I can feel it. This baby wants to be here. He's strong." "How do you know it's a he?" Pete asked, trying to smile. "I just know." Grace was right. Their second son was born in February of 1887 in the middle of a rare snowstorm that blanketed the New Mexico desert in white. The birth was long but uncomplicated, and when Pete heard the baby's cry, he felt years of tension drain away. They named him Pietro, Peter in Italian, after Pete, but using his mother's language. He was a big baby with a shock of dark hair and lungs that rivaled his older brother's. "Our family is complete," Grace said, holding Pietro while Thomas and Maria looked on with wide eyes. 4 is a good number. Perfect. Antonio was 63 by then, his hair completely gray, his movements slower than they'd been. But holding his new grandson seemed to take years off him. 3 grandchildren, he marveled. My Maria would have been so happy. That spring, Antonio's health began to decline. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, then weakness that made it hard for him to do the work he'd always done. Pete took over more and more of the ranch operations, and Grace spent her days caring for her father and the new baby. In May, Antonio called Pete and Grace to his bedside. He looked smaller than Pete had ever seen him, his face gaunt, his breathing labored. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice weak. "The ranch, the land, all of it is in both your names now. I had the papers drawn up in Las Cruces last month. Everything I have is yours." "Papa, don't talk like that," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to get better." Antonio shook his head. "My time is coming, daughter. I can feel it, and I'm ready. Your mother has been waiting for me long enough." He reached out and took Grace's hand, then Pete's. "You've been a good son to me, Pete, better than I could have hoped for. Take care of my daughter, my grandchildren." "Always," Pete said, his voice thick, and Grace keeps singing. "Fill this land with music, that's what your mother would want, what I want." Antonio's eyes drifted closed. "I'm tired now. Let me rest." He died that night quietly in his sleep. They buried him next to Maria, on a small hill overlooking the ranch, under a cottonwood tree that he'd planted when they first claimed the land. The same neighbors who had come to Pete and Grace's wedding came to the funeral, and Grace sang, her voice breaking with grief but still beautiful, still powerful. In the days after Antonio's death, Pete worried that Grace would withdraw into her grief the way Antonio had after losing Maria. But Grace was stronger than that, or maybe just more determined to honor her parents' memory by living fully. "They wouldn't want me to stop living," she told Pete one night as they lay in bed, Pietro sleeping in a cradle nearby. "They'd want me to keep going, to raise our children, to sing, to love. That's the best tribute I can give them." So they kept going. Pete ran the ranch with the help of occasional hired hands, expanding the herd to over 100 head. Thomas, now 9, started taking on real responsibilities, learning the cattle business from the ground up. Maria, at 6, helped her mother in the house and garden, and she sang constantly, filling the homestead with music just as Grace had promised Antonio she would. Pietro grew into a sturdy, cheerful toddler who followed his older siblings everywhere, determined to keep up despite his short legs. The house rang with children's laughter, with Grace's singing, with the sounds of a life fully lived. In the summer of 1890, when Pete was 38 and Grace was 34, they took the children on a trip to Las Cruces for supplies and business. It was a rare excursion, as the ranch kept them busy most of the time, but Pete needed to meet with the land office about expanding their grazing rights, and Grace wanted to buy fabric for new clothes for the growing children. Las Cruces had grown since Pete first came to New Mexico, now a proper town with a church, a school, several stores, and even a small hotel. The children were wide-eyed at the sight of so many buildings, so many people. Thomas, at 11, tried to act unimpressed, but Pete could see the wonder in his eyes. They stayed at the hotel for 2 nights, a rare luxury. On the second evening, there was a social at the church, and the whole town turned out. Someone had a fiddle, someone else a guitar, and there was dancing and singing. Grace was coaxed into singing, and when she did, the whole crowd fell silent, listening in awe to this woman from a remote ranch who had the voice of an angel. Afterward, a well-dressed woman approached them, introducing herself as Mrs. Alina Hartford, wife of a wealthy rancher from Texas who was in town on business. "Your voice is extraordinary," she told Grace. "Have you ever considered singing professionally? In San Francisco or Denver? You could make a real name for yourself." Grace smiled and shook her head. "Thank you, but my place is at home with my family. I sing for them and for myself and for God. That's enough." Mrs. Hartford looked disappointed but nodded. A rare choice in this modern age, but perhaps a wise one. "Your family is blessed to have you." On the ride back to the ranch, Thomas said, "Mama, why didn't you want to go sing in the big cities? You're better than anyone I've ever heard." Grace reached over and ruffled his hair. "Because singing in a big city wouldn't make me happy, son. What makes me happy is here, on this land with all of you. Success isn't about how many people know your name. It's about knowing that you're living the life you were meant to live." Pete reached over and squeezed her hand, loving her more in that moment than he had even on their wedding day. The 1890s brought changes to the New Mexico territory. More people were moving west, more homesteads were being claimed, and the open range that Pete had known when he first arrived was slowly being fenced off and divided. There were tensions sometimes between the old-timers and the newcomers, between cattle ranchers and sheep herders, between those who wanted the territory to become a state, and those who preferred the more lawless freedom of territorial status. Pete tried to stay out of the politics, focusing instead on his family and his ranch. But in 1893, a dispute arose with a neighboring rancher, a man named Jack Saunders, who had recently bought the property to the south of Pete's land. Saunders claimed that some of Pete's cattle had been grazing on his land and demanded compensation. Pete rode over to talk to Saunders, trying to settle the matter peacefully. Saunders was a hard man, recently arrived from Kansas, with a reputation for quick anger and quicker fists. But Pete kept his temper in check, explaining that the cattle had probably just wandered, that he'd make sure to keep a closer eye on them. "Not good enough," Saunders said. "I want payment for the grass they ate, and I want a fence built on the property line." "I can build a fence," Pete said. "But I'm not paying for grass. Cattle wander, it's what they do. I'll keep them on my side of the line from now on." Saunders stepped closer, his face red. "You calling me a liar, saying I'm making this up?" "I'm saying cattle wander and I'll fix the problem," Pete said evenly. No need for anyone to get heated. For a moment, Pete thought Saunders might throw a punch, but then the man seemed to think better of it and stepped back. "Fine. But if I see any of your cattle on my land again, I'm shooting them. You understand me?" Pete nodded stiffly and rode away, angry but trying to keep it under control. When he got home and told Grace about the confrontation, she listened quietly, then said, "Some men carry anger like a disease and they spread it everywhere they go. Don't let him infect you with it." "I won't," Pete promised. "But I don't trust him. I'm going to make sure the children stay close to the house when they're outside. I don't want them wandering near his property." The fence was built over the next weeks, and there were no more confrontations with Saunders, though Pete occasionally saw the man watching from his property line, a dark presence that made Pete uneasy. Despite the tension with the neighbor, life continued on in its rhythms. Thomas was now 14 and doing the work of a full-grown man, riding out with Pete to check on the cattle, helping with the branding and the roundups. He'd grown tall and strong, with his father's build and his mother's green eyes. Maria, at 11, was turning into a beautiful young woman, though she seemed unaware of it. She was more interested in her music than in anything else, spending hours practicing songs her mother taught her, developing her own style that was somehow both like Grace's and uniquely her own. Pietro, now 6, was the wild one, always running, always exploring, always getting into trouble. He had his grandfather Antonio's fearlessness and his mother's stubborn independence, a combination that kept Pete and Grace constantly on their toes. In the fall of 1895, a traveling photographer came through the area, and Grace insisted they have a family portrait made. Pete grumbled about the expense and the fuss, but secretly he was pleased. They dressed in their best clothes and posed in front of the house, Pete and Grace seated with Pietro between them, Thomas and Maria standing behind. When the photograph arrived a few weeks later, carried by the same traveling merchant who had taken Pete's first letter to Missouri all those years ago, Grace hung it in the parlor next to the photograph of her mother. "3 generations," she said softly, looking at the images. "Mama would have loved to see this." That winter was hard, with heavy snows and bitter cold that was unusual for New Mexico. They lost several head of cattle to the weather, and there were days when Pete wondered if they'd make it through. But they pulled together as a family, Pete and Thomas braving the cold to bring the cattle closer to the barn, Grace and Maria preparing hot meals and keeping the fires burning, little Pietro helping however he could. When spring finally came, Pete was exhausted but grateful. They'd survived another winter, another challenge. The ranch was still theirs, the family was healthy, and there was love and music filling the small house just as there always had been. On a warm evening in April, almost exactly 17 years after Pete had first heard Grace singing in the canyon, he suggested they take a walk. Grace agreed, and they left the children under Thomas's supervision and walked together toward the canyon. They stood in the same spot where Pete had first seen her, where they'd first confessed their feelings for each other. The stream was running high with snowmelt, the canyon walls glowing red in the setting sun. "Sing for me," Pete said, "like you did that first day." Grace looked at him, a small smile on her face. "I'm older now. My voice isn't what it was." "It's better," Pete said. "Everything about you is better." So Grace sang, the same wordless melody she'd been singing that day 17 years ago, and Pete stood there listening, falling in love with her all over again. When she finished, he pulled her close. "I was lost before I found you," he said. "I didn't even know how lost I was. But your voice led me home, Grace, led me to the life I was meant to live." "We led each other home," Grace said, resting her head against his chest. "I was here, waiting, even though I didn't know what I was waiting for. And then you came riding along that canyon rim and everything made sense." They stood there as the sun went down and the stars came out. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family in the harsh New Mexico desert, who had learned that home isn't a place but a person, a voice, a love that changes everything. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual joys and sorrows. Thomas fell in love with a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet young woman named Sarah who could ride as well as any man. They married in 1898, when Thomas was 19 and Sarah was 18, and Pete and Grace built them a small house on the ranch property, starting a new generation. Maria showed no interest in marriage, focused instead on her music. At 15, she was already composing her own songs, blending her mother's Italian melodies with the sounds of the American West she'd grown up in. Grace encouraged her, never pushing her toward the conventional path of marriage and children. Pietro, at 11, was showing signs of inheriting his father's restlessness, talking about seeing the ocean someday, or the mountains of Colorado, or the great cities back east. Pete understood the urge to wander, but he hoped Pietro would find his way home again, the way Pete had. In the spring of 1900, as a new century began, Pete turned 48 and Grace turned 44. They were sitting on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, listening to Maria practice inside the house and Pietro arguing with his older brother about something inconsequential. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked suddenly. "Staying here, I mean. You could have kept wandering, seen more of the country, lived a different life." Pete looked at her, surprised by the question. "Not for a single second. This is the life I was meant to live, Grace. With you, with our children on this land. Everything I did before I found you was just wandering in circles. You're my center. You're my home." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Pete Rawlings. I loved you the moment I saw you sitting on that horse in the canyon, looking like you'd found something he'd been searching for his whole life." "I had," Pete said, taking her hand. "I found you." From inside the house, Maria's voice rose in a new song she'd been working on, something about the desert and the stars and the persistence of love. Grace tilted her head, listening, then smiled. "She's going to be better than me," Grace said. "Her voice has something special in it." "She learned from the best," Pete said. "Both of you have that gift, that ability to make people stop and listen, to touch something deep inside with just your voice." "It's not just the voice," Grace said. "It's what you put into it. You have to sing from the heart, from the place where your deepest truths live. Otherwise, it's just noise." As the years continued into the new century, the ranch continued to prosper under Pete's management and Thomas's increasingly capable help. Sarah gave birth to Pete and Grace's first grandchild in 1899, a baby girl they named Grace after her grandmother. When Grace held her namesake for the first time, Pete saw tears streaming down her face. "Mama and Papa would have loved to see this," she whispered. "4 generations, all from that one decision my mother made to leave Italy and come to this strange country." "It's a good legacy," Pete said. In 1902, Maria surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to travel to Santa Fe to study music more formally. A music teacher had come through Las Cruces and heard her sing, telling her she had potential that shouldn't be wasted. Grace and Pete discussed it at length, worried about their daughter traveling alone, but finally agreed. Maria was 20 now, old enough to make her own decisions. "Just promise you'll come home," Grace said when Maria left, dressed in her traveling clothes with a small trunk of belongings. "I'll always come home," Maria promised. "This is where my heart is, where my music comes from. I just need to learn how to make it better." Pietro, now 14, was already talking about joining the army, seeing the world beyond New Mexico. Pete tried not to worry, but he remembered being that age, feeling trapped and restless, desperate to break free. He just hoped Pietro would find his way back, the way Pete had. Thomas and Sarah welcomed a second child in 1903, a boy they named Antonio for his great-grandfather. The ranch now had 2 houses, multiple barns, over 200 head of cattle, and several horses. It was more than Pete had ever dreamed of when he'd first arrived at this remote homestead 25 years ago, following a voice that had called to something deep in his soul. In the fall of 1905, Maria returned from Santa Fe, her studies complete. She'd learned much but was clearly happy to be home, embracing her parents fiercely when she arrived. "I learned technique and theory and all sorts of useful things," she told them. "But the teachers all said the same thing, that the real gift I have isn't something that can be taught. It comes from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. From your heart," Grace said. "From the land, from your family, from the music that's been passed down through generations." "Exactly," Maria said, smiling. She settled back into life on the ranch, and soon the small house was filled with music again, both Grace and Maria singing together, their voices blending in harmonies that made Pete stop whatever he was doing just to listen. In 1906, Pietro turned 18 and did join the army, despite Pete's concerns. But he promised to serve his time and come back, to take his place on the ranch that would someday be his as much as Thomas's. Pete watched him ride away and felt a piece of his heart go with him, but also pride that his son wanted to see the world, to test himself. That same year, Pete and Grace celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. Their children and now grandchildren threw them a party inviting neighbors from all around. There was food and dancing and music, and at the end of the night, Grace sang. She was 49 now, her hair streaked with gray, lines around her eyes and mouth. But when she sang, she was timeless, ageless, and her voice was as powerful as it had ever been. Pete stood there listening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by the community they'd helped build, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the life he'd been given. In 1908, Maria met a man, a music teacher from Albuquerque who came to Las Cruces to visit family. His name was David Preston, and he was everything Maria needed, someone who understood her passion for music, who encouraged rather than tried to control it. They courted for 6 months before he asked for her hand in marriage, and Grace and Pete gave their blessing gladly. Maria and David were married in the summer of 1909, and they built a house on the ranch near Thomas and Sarah's. David taught music to children in Las Cruces and the surrounding area, traveling during the week and coming home to Maria on weekends. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, but it worked for them, and that was all that mattered. Pietro came home from the army in 1910, full of stories about the places he'd seen, and the things he'd done. But he seemed content to settle down on the ranch, taking his place alongside Thomas in running the growing operation. He was 22 now, a man, and Pete could see Antonio in him, that same quiet strength and determination. In 1911, when Pete was 59 and Grace was 55, they sat down and started making plans for the future, for how the ranch would be divided when they were gone, how to make sure all three of their children were provided for. It was a sobering conversation, an acknowledgement of their own mortality, but necessary. "I don't want you talking like this," Grace said. "We have years left." "I hope so," Pete said, "but I want to make sure everything is in order, that our children are taken care of. I want them to know that this land, this legacy, it's for all of them." They drew up papers with a lawyer in Las Cruces, ensuring that the ranch would be split evenly between Thomas, Maria, and Pietro. Each of them would have a share. Each would have a say in how it was run. Pete knew that not all families managed to stay together through inheritance disputes, but he hoped his children loved each other enough to make it work. The years of the 1910s brought new challenges. The weather seemed more unpredictable, with droughts lasting longer and harder. There was talk of a war in Europe, and when America joined in 1917, Pietro wanted to re-enlist. Pete talked him out of it, reminding him that the ranch needed him, that he'd already served his time. "Let the younger men go," Pete said. "You've done your part." The ranch continued to thrive despite the challenges, and by 1918, Pete and Grace had 5 grandchildren between Thomas's family and Maria's. Pietro still hadn't married, claiming he hadn't found the right woman yet, and Pete didn't push. He remembered what it was like to wander until you found the person who felt like home. In the spring of 1920, Pete woke one morning with pain in his chest that wouldn't go away. Grace wanted to send for a doctor, but Pete refused, saying it was just indigestion. But over the next weeks, the pain came and went, and he found himself getting tired more easily, running out of breath when he worked. Finally, Grace put her foot down and sent Thomas to fetch the doctor from Las Cruces. The doctor examined Pete and delivered the news that Pete had been afraid of. His heart was weak, probably had been for years, and he needed to slow down. "I'm 68 years old," Pete told the doctor. "I've been working hard my whole life. I don't know how to slow down." "Then you'd better learn," the doctor said bluntly, "or you won't see 70. So Pete grudgingly stepped back from the daily running of the ranch, letting Thomas and Pietro take over fully. It chafed at him being idle, but Grace kept him occupied with small projects around the house, and he spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride, telling them stories about the old days. On a warm evening in June of 1921, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset like they had 1,000 times before, Grace said, "Do you remember the first time you heard me sing?" "Every detail," Pete said. "I was riding along the canyon rim, feeling lost and restless, and then I heard your voice floating up from below. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, still is. I was singing for my mother that day," Grace said softly, "missing her, wishing she was still alive. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I was praying." "Maybe that's what we were for each other," Pete said. "Answers to prayers we didn't know we were praying." Grace reached over and took his hand, her fingers laced through his. "I want you to know something, Pete Rawlings. These 43 years with you have been the happiest of my life. Every day, even the hard ones, even the ones where nothing went right, I was grateful to be living them with you." "Grace, why are you talking like this?" "Because I want you to know. Because we're not young anymore, and I don't want to leave anything unsaid." She looked at him with those green eyes that had captivated him from the first moment. "You followed my voice into that canyon, and you gave me everything I ever wanted. A home, children, a life full of love and music. I couldn't have asked for more. Pete felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. You gave me everything too. A purpose, a place to belong, a reason to stop running. I was lost before I found you, Grace, completely lost. They sat there as the stars came out, holding hands, listening to the sounds of their grandchildren playing in the distance and the cattle lowing in the pastures. It was a perfect moment, one of thousands they'd shared over the years, and Pete wanted to hold on to it forever. In the fall of 1921, Grace became ill. It started as a cold that wouldn't go away, then became something worse. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and ordered complete bed rest. Pete sat by her bedside day and night, refusing to leave, holding her hand and reading to her and telling her stories about their life together. Maria came and sang to her mother, beautiful songs that filled the small room with love and hope. Thomas brought the grandchildren in one by one to say hello, to tell their grandmother they loved her. Pietro sat quietly in the corner, his face drawn with worry. Grace rallied for a while, seemed to get better, and Pete allowed himself to hope. But then she took a turn for the worse, and the doctor's face told Pete everything he needed to know. On a cold November night, with Pete holding her hand and their children gathered around, Grace opened her eyes and looked at each of them in turn. "I love you all so much," she whispered. "Take care of each other. And Pete, keep the music alive. Promise me." "I promise," Pete said, his voice breaking. Grace smiled, then closed her eyes and was gone, slipping away as quietly as a song fading into silence. Pete felt something break inside him, something fundamental and irreparable. The woman who had been his center, his home, his reason for everything, was gone. He sat there holding her hand long after it had gone cold, unable to let go, unable to accept that she was really gone. They buried Grace on the hill next to her parents, under the cottonwood tree that had grown tall and strong over the years. The whole community turned out for the funeral, a testament to how many lives Grace had touched with her music and her kindness. Maria sang, her voice breaking with grief but still beautiful, and Pete stood there with tears streaming down his face, unable to look away from the grave that held the woman he loved. The weeks after Grace's death were the darkest of Pete's life. He moved through the days like a ghost, doing what needed to be done but feeling nothing, caring about nothing. The house was too quiet without Grace's singing, too empty without her presence. Thomas and Pietro worried about him, checking on him constantly, trying to get him to eat, to sleep, to engage with life again. Maria came every day, sitting with him, sometimes singing, sometimes just holding his hand in silence. "How did your grandfather do it?" Pete asked her one day. "How did he go on after your grandmother died? He had you and Mama," Maria said softly. "He had something to live for. You have us, Papa. You have your children and grandchildren. We need you." But Pete felt hollowed out, like there was nothing left inside him. Grace had been the best part of him, and without her, he didn't know who he was supposed to be. One day in early spring, about 4 months after Grace's death, Pete found himself walking toward the canyon. He hadn't been there since that last evening with Grace, hadn't been able to face it. But something drew him there now, some need he couldn't name. He stood in the spot where he'd first seen Grace, where she'd stood barefoot in the stream and sang with her eyes closed and her face tilted toward the sky. He could almost see her there, could almost hear her voice echoing off the canyon walls, and then he did hear it. A voice singing, coming from somewhere nearby. Pete's heart leaped, irrational hope flooding through him for a moment before reason reasserted itself. It wasn't Grace. It couldn't be Grace. He followed the sound and found Maria, standing in the stream just as her mother had, singing one of the Italian songs her grandmother had taught Grace. Her eyes were closed, tears running down her face, but her voice was strong and pure and beautiful. Pete stood there listening, and something in his chest, something that had been frozen since Grace died, began to thaw. Maria was Grace's legacy, her gift to the world. The music would go on. Grace would go on through her daughter, through her grandchildren, through the songs that would be passed down through generations. When Maria finished singing and opened her eyes, she saw Pete standing there. "Papa," she said, stepping out of the stream, "I didn't know you were there." "Your mother would have been so proud of you," Pete said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your voice is even more beautiful than hers was." "I learned from the best," Maria said, coming to stand beside him. "Mama and grandmother both. Their music lives in me, Papa. It always will." Pete put his arm around his daughter, and together they stood there in the canyon where so much had begun, where a voice had led a lost cowboy to the love he'd been searching for. "Thank you," Pete said softly. "For what?" "For reminding me that she's not really gone. That as long as there's music, as long as there's love, she'll always be with us." Maria leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "She will. And so will you, Papa. When you're gone, your story will live on." The story of the cowboy who followed a voice into a canyon and found everything he'd been searching for. Pete lived for 8 more years after Grace's death. Years that were bittersweet but not without joy. He watched his grandchildren grow, welcomed 2 more into the world. He saw Pietro finally find love with a widow from Las Cruces, a kind woman named Catherine, who brought music back into his son's life. He sat on the porch in the evenings and listened to Maria and her children sing, carrying on the tradition that had started in a small village in Italy and had traveled across an ocean to take root in the New Mexico desert. In the spring of 1929, at the age of 77, Pete knew his time was coming. His heart, which had been weak for years, was finally giving out. He wasn't afraid. He'd lived a full life, had known love deeper than most people ever experienced, had built something lasting. On a warm April evening, almost exactly 51 years after he'd first heard Grace singing in the canyon, Pete gathered his children and grandchildren around him. "I want you to remember something," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I was lost for a long time, wandering without purpose or direction. And then I heard your mother singing, your grandmother, and I followed that voice to the greatest love I've ever known." He looked at each of them in turn. "Love is worth following no matter where it leads you. It's worth fighting for, worth building a life around. Your mother taught me that. Don't ever forget it." That night, Pete died quietly in his sleep, a smile on his face, and those who were there swore they could hear singing, faint and beautiful, as he passed from this world to whatever came next. They buried Pete next to Grace on the hill, and the whole community turned out to pay their respects to the man who had helped build this corner of New Mexico into something lasting. Maria sang at the funeral, and her voice carried across the land, a tribute to the love story that had started with a song and had never really ended. The ranch continued on through the generations, passed down from Thomas and Pietro and Maria to their children and their children's children. And in every generation, there was music. The songs that had come from Italy through Maria Romano, that had drawn Pete Rawlings into a canyon and changed his life forever, continued to be sung. The story became a legend in that part of New Mexico, the tale of the cowboy who had followed a voice and found love. Young people courting would walk to the canyon where Pete had first seen Grace, hoping some of that magic might bless their own relationships. The hill where Pete and Grace were buried became a pilgrimage site of sorts, people leaving flowers and notes, asking for blessings on their own love stories. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right through the canyon, people swore they could still hear it. A woman's voice, singing wordlessly, calling out across the years to the man who had loved her, reminding the world that true love never really dies. It just changes form, becoming part of the land itself, woven into the very fabric of the place where it bloomed. The house where Pete and Grace had raised their family stood for over 100 years, carefully maintained by their descendants, a monument to what they had built together. The canyon remained unchanged, still echoing with songs sung by Grace's great-great-grandchildren, who learned the melodies from their parents and grandparents, keeping the tradition alive. In the modern era, when New Mexico finally achieved statehood and the Wild West became history, the story of Pete and Grace was written down, preserved, shared. It became a reminder of a time when life was harder but perhaps simpler, when love could bloom in unexpected places, when a voice could change everything. And the lesson at the heart of their story remained true across the generations. That sometimes the thing you've been searching for your whole life is waiting for you in an unexpected place, and all you have to do is be brave enough to follow the call, to chase the voice that speaks to something deep in your soul, to trust that love, when it's real, will lead you home. Pete Rawlings had been a lost cowboy, drifting without purpose, until the day he heard Grace Romano singing in a canyon in the New Mexico territory. He'd followed that voice, and it had led him to love, to family, to purpose, to a life richer and fuller than he'd ever imagined possible. And in the end, that was all any person could hope for. To find the thing they were meant to find, to love and be loved in return, and to leave behind something good when they were gone. The ranch still stood, the canyon still echoed with songs, and the love story that had started on an April day in 1878 continued to inspire those who heard it, a reminder that in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, love remained the greatest adventure, the truest magic, the one thing worth searching for until you found it.